In 1952, the Austrian writer Erik Ritter von Kuehnelt Leddihn published his work Liberty or Equality. The premise of the book is that the principles of liberty and equality are, contrary to modern belief, actually opposed to each other, such that democracies inevitably become tyrannies. This book is a wide-ranging survey of anti-democratic opinion that spans as far back as the 18th century, and Leddihn does a wonderful job collating many quotations from diverse authors related to the problem of democracy and equality. However, the book is not without flaws. In the first place, many of his arguments are outdated and based on faulty assumptions about the nature of democracy, namely the idea that democracy is genuine rule by the people. Second, Leddihn, coming from a Catholic background, rejects racism as both an exercise in democratic populism as well as a sentiment of equality in which everything within the race is leveled. He adopts a very literal defense of diversity, arguing that the strength of monarchical Europe owed to its relative defense of minorities as well as the mixed ethnic makeup of its rulers. I will criticize Leddihn's myopic treatment of ethnocentrism later in the video, and I will address the outdated nature of some of these anti-democratic arguments as well. My general opinion of the book is actually quite negative, and I will explain why later, but for now I will start with the first few chapters. First, Leddihn gives a quick historiography of the term liberal. Liberal originally simply meant a person who values human liberty. Originated in Spain, liberales, and then spread to France, as well as to the rest of the continent. The original liberals were not democratists, but rather supporters of the monarchy who believed in the importance of human liberty inside the regime. A true liberal, Leddihn writes, would defend monarchy or even a traditional dictatorship if he thought that these forms of government would better defend liberty than a democracy. Today, however, the term liberal has confounded support for liberty and support for democracy into one. It is the task of Leddihn, then, to demonstrate how this modern development has led to an erroneous and dangerous conception of politics. Leddihn then goes on to present the opinions of various liberal, anti-democratic authors who he believes were prophetic in their accounts of how democracy would evolve in Europe and North America. Some names that appear are John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville, Montesquieu, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Donoso Cortez, and many others who we probably have not heard of before. The primary source of this argumentation comes from Plato's treatment of democracy in Book 8 of the Republic, which is the origin of the theory that democracies end up becoming tyrannies. His theory is that governments degenerate over time, originating in aristocracy ruled by a philosopher king, then, through involution, becoming a timocracy in which the highest virtue is the acquisition of wealth. Timocracies become oligarchies where the appetite for the accumulation of wealth grows to extreme proportions and greed becomes the ruling principle, and then oligarchy becomes democracy, which then becomes tyranny. The transition from oligarchy to democracy occurs due to class conflict. The lower class grows in size, and they become resentful of the wealth possessed by the oligarchs vis-a-vis their own poverty. They then revolt against the oligarchs, creating a democracy. Under a democracy, this process continues, and the lower classes enlist the help of powerful men to attack the upper classes. These men, now successful in their revolt, become tyrants, who utilize their newfound power to push down genius and talent wherever it appears, since it is a threat to their regime. Accordingly, many of the authors Leddihn presents argue that democracy is ruled by the mediocre. The principle of political equality gives power indiscriminately to those of both high and low intelligence, and since those of low intelligence are more numerous, the mob of the mediocre overwhelms the intelligent and defines the exercise of state power. Other authors noted that this situation would create demand for society to be ruled by experts in order to ameliorate the problem, and so democracy ends up becoming a technocracy. This argument assumes, of course, that the masses are genuinely given power. Similarly, these authors also believe that democracies would devolve into class warfare, with the masses calling upon their leaders to confiscate the wealth of the upper classes. This argument is clearly lifted straight from the Republic. Another argument presented is that in democracy, there is a condition of irresponsibility since power is held by the masses. In times of war, democracies cannot negotiate peace nor grant mercy to their enemies because the people, unlike a monarch, have no conscience, and so all wars become wars of total destruction and conquest. Democracy is thus akin to a tyranny in the way that it conducts war and treats its enemies. Now, although this does seem to be true, it's not as though the people vote on wars. This tendency must be for some other reason, perhaps because democracies are such good war machines, or perhaps because the elected representatives do not rule for an extended period of time and thus have no continuity. Other authors saw in democracy that the general leveling trend of equality leads to a regime of uniformity. They noted the standardization of law in Napoleon's codes, as well as the phenomenon of members of democracies and democratic tyrannies donning and respecting uniforms. Leddihn later expands on this point, arguing that democracies are contingent upon ideological conformity, a consensus that the democratic mode of government is the most just and correct system. Systems of universal education are devised, once again we see the trend of uniformity, to indoctrinate the masses into the principles of democracy and equality. Thus, distinct regionalisms tend to disappear. Democratic countries establish a single national language and merge all regional ethnicities into one population. We can see how this eventually unfolded in the United States, since regional populations of, for example, ethnic Germans like the kind who used to live in Texas disappeared and lost their regional languages. This can be seen chiefly in Theodore Roosevelt's criticism of hyphenated Americans. This uniformity of culture then prepares the people for the emergence of a unifying tyranny or dictatorship. Tocqueville, after having visited the United States for a couple of years, feared that under democracy, the masses would choose security over liberty. He believed that the masses generally were hedonistic, and he thought similarly to Plato, insofar as they sought only to fill their bellies like animals. As such, when given power, he believed that they would hand over their autonomy to authorities that would promise to take care of them. For Tocqueville, the tyranny that would result from democracy would be akin to what we today know as global neo-capitalism of the kind outlined in Project 2030, which you might know by the phrase, "You will own nothing and be happy." The state will oversee the lives of all people from cradle to the grave. Although Leddihn was less hopeful for a tyranny of hedonism, as he believed that when inevitably politics outstripped morality, we would see concentration camps aimed at reducing dissent rather than a blissful dictatorship. Leddihn notes that Thomas Jefferson, who was a Republican opponent of democracy, foresaw that democracy would lead away from the preferred agrarian society, which in his view guaranteed personal autonomy, and instead toward rapid urbanization of the population where they would cease to be landowners with any stake in the welfare of the country. He feared that mob rule would demolish liberty, which was the reason behind the property qualification for voting. Thus, in Leddihn's view, the Founding Fathers were not democratists, but rather aristocratic Republicans. He traces the beginning of American democracy to Andrew Jackson, who advocated for the elimination of the property qualification, although one might note that Jeffersonian democracy had previously already accomplished much of this, despite Jefferson's verbal repudiation of democracy. Other authors note that democracy is contingent upon demagoguery. Elections are won through stirring up the irrational emotions of the people, and so as a result, democracies are in a permanent state of chaos, which eventually leads to the revolution that establishes tyranny. Finally, the argument is advanced that democracies tend to lead to mob rule, the domination of a political minority by the political majority. If the policies of the government are determined by majority vote, then there's little recourse a political minority can have to exert its own interests. This has not been an exhaustive presentation of the quotes contained in the book. For that, you should read the book yourself. But we can see that there is a general theme here which bears some examination, namely that it is often taken for granted that democracy genuinely empowers the masses. This is an idea, however, I must challenge. I've stated it elsewhere, but the world's democracies are really anything but democratic in the true sense of the word. They are always managed and regulated by institutions, and the people who truly govern in a democracy are those who control the electoral process and who thus have the ability to manufacture consent. The system of party politics effectively empowers the elites who form parties and determine who gets to run for office and on what platform, not the masses themselves. The masses are given a manufactured choice between what the rulers of the parties present to them. This is perhaps because we have parliamentary and republican systems, not direct democracies. But simply because a system is not direct democracy does not mean that it lacks democratic elements, as even Leddihn himself argues. Despite this problem of interpretation, Certain of these prophetic arguments are indeed true. Democracy does beget demagoguery. Democracies do produce resentment. Democracies do lead to total war and a general irresponsibility for the elected and appointed officials. Democracies do produce chaos and the polity. We then move on to Leddihn's personal analysis of democracy. He reiterates much of what was established in the previous chapter, but of note are some more original arguments regarding the transition of democracy into tyranny. Following the argument that democracy creates uniformism, Leddihn argues that democracy is behind the trend toward ethnic nationalism in the early 20th century, as well as behind the general growth of nationalism around the world. Ethnic nationalism, to Leddihn, is actually the victory of the equalitarian leveling trend in society. He notes that in Nazi Germany, there is an effort to ensure equality among Aryans, and he further states that this is a sign of a truly proletarianized nation. Leddihn also believes that emphasis on race is contrary to regionalism. As previous to racial collectivism, people more so identify themselves with their region than with their race or nation. To make of regions a single uniformity enables those who live within them to better become subjects of a single state. Leddihn's hostility to racism, however, is quite objectionable in more than one way. In the first place, we might argue that regionalism has an implicit racism, since there is an inherent skepticism and distrust toward people who are not of the same stock as those who live in the region. To oppose racialism and regionalism is to split what in reality is a unity. But also what Leddihn did not see in 1952 is that race itself is a doctrine of universal inequality. While racial collectivism does have internal leveling elements, in another sense, it also has an external elevating potential once we consider the relations between different races. In our modern world, where skepticism of racial differences has led to a universal doctrine of human equality, we have seen how it has been abused to disrupt the organic bonds that, throughout history, have bound together nations and states, whether they are monarchical or not. It has been used to attack the very culture of the West, including his beloved Catholicism. The basic fact of the matter is that Leddihn refused to address the problem of demographic replacement. When France becomes an Arab nation, it will no longer be Catholic. So the idea that we can somehow better practice Catholicism through racial equality and respect for minorities becomes obviously self-defeating. The title of the book is Liberty or Equality, not Liberty and Racial Equality. It's not so much a matter of respecting minorities as it is a problem of preventing the racial minority from becoming the majority. Those who are on the side of inequality, such as Leddihn, should in reality be racialists. The egalitarian opposition posits that humans are all born equal, and this consequentially means that race does not exist, or at best has an aesthetic or social existence. It is a denial of inequality intrinsically, which is foremost on the side of democracy, through a redefinition of what the people means. Leddihn holds that diversity is akin to differentiation, and that racial homogeneity is the enemy of differentiation. But the truth of the matter is rather that racial homogeneity is the foundation of differentiation. We would lose all the various kinds of diverse white people if they were admixed out of existence, and if they became diaspora, then we would also risk losing them entirely. I've already discussed this question in my video on Joel Davis's debate with Drew Pavlo, so I will only say this shortly. True diversity is exclusive. False diversity is inclusive. Leddihn is presenting a very literal, inclusive version of diversity as if it were the same as differentiation. But really, is a Kalergi soup all that differentiated? To bring this subject to a close, I must note that racism is not a modern development, contrary to what Leddihn insists, who pins the beginning of racism on Darwin and Gobineau. Racism stretches back to classical antiquity, notably to Egypt, and ethnocentrism as a behavior has evolutionary origins that stretch back to when we lived in tribes. Racism was not a populist invention of the Nazis to equalize Aryans together, but rather it has been an extant reality of inequality that has ruled the world up until today and the emergence of democratic anti-racism. To say that ethnic nationalism gets to have an exclusive claim to racial exclusivism and ethnocentrism is nonsense. Monarchies have practiced slavery, such as those in the medieval Arab countries. Racism was a thoroughgoing part of that people's regime. Customs of blood purity, likewise, can be found in various places in the traditional world, especially among the aristocracy. Leddihn sees the ethnically mixed nature of European dynasties as if it were a universal rule, but in reality, it is a mere contingency, and it's also worth noting that they were not racially mixed. In feudal Japan, as well as in imperial China, the aristocracy always held close to a principle of blood purity, seeking to keep foreign and barbarian blood out of their lineages, which they saw to be animalistic. Plato, in his Republic, advances also a kind of proto-racism through his doctrine of the metals in man. He did not want those with gold blood to mix with those of any other shade of blood. Thus, to see in racism the victory of the principle of equality, or necessarily the victory of the principle of democracy, is to be historically and politically illiterate on the question, as well as to form a contradiction in the very core of this book's thesis. Leddihn's view may have been somewhat understandable in 1952, when there wasn't a serious problem of racial conflict in the West, and when the discussion and historiography of race was less advanced. But today, it is a foremost question in the minds of any right-leaning person. I once said to myself that Republicans should read Liberty or Equality to dispense from their minds the value of democracy. But to that, I might also add that they should read Avila too. This book's weakness on race is its worst quality, but generally, as I read the book longer, I found it to be more and more generally disappointing, as Leddihn's insistence on Judeo-Christianity might demonstrate. We might say that Leddihn's hostility toward racialism stems from his Catholic universalism, but it's worth noting that Catholicism does not doctrinally repudiate racialism in any serious way. There does exist a sin of racism, but that is merely the sin of racial idolatry of the kind practiced by Hitler or William Luther Pierce. The universalism of Christianity is strictly spiritualistic and carries with it no demand to create racially nor ethnically mixed societies. What's even more important is that Catholicism has repeatedly defended the right of nations to maintain a cohesive national and ethnic identity. Popes have repeatedly reiterated the right of nations to control immigration for the benefit of the host population, and the doctrine of the order of charity also carries with it an implicit ethnocentrism, that we should take care of our own race before we worry about others. The modern phenomenon of mass migration, justified by the pretense that it improves the lives of migrants, is objectionable on a Catholic basis, since it tends to lead to a decline in the welfare of people in their own nation who have an extant duty to each other. Thus, Leddihn's interpretation of the Catholic doctrine is very modern and quote-unquote liberal in the worst way possible. Leddihn then advances the argument that democracies ensure the growth of the total state by way of making every single person into a polity. Under monarchy, people generally enjoyed a great distance from their government. They were not necessarily subjects, but rather persons. However, under a democracy, the political and the social are gradually intertwined into a single unity. There is nothing in a democracy that is not the domain of the state, and so as a result, democracies are capable of fostering institutions and leveraging power that was impossible in the age of monarchy, such as the universal draft, the income tax, as well as social policies like prohibition. There are a few other arguments that Leddihn makes, but for the sake of time, and perhaps because they weren't very memorable, I will skip over them. In the next chapter, he explains the virtues of monarchy, which more or less boils down to the personalistic nature of monarchy, the maintenance of continuity due to its hereditary nature, as well as the greater investment of education for the purpose in the monarch, because unlike a politician, a monarch is not trained for a career, but rather he is trained to rule. The following chapters are a diversion into a discussion of the differences between the attitudes of Catholics and Protestants. This is where Leddihn begins one of the worst traits of this book, which is his irrelevant historical spurging. His basic schema is that Catholics are individualistic and liberal, while Protestants are collectivistic and morally severe. But Catholics are also more prone to violence and revolt. He notes the penchant for anarchism in Catholic countries, while Protestants hold a high premium on obedience to authority. The reason for this exposition is that he, in the next chapter, tries to trace the origins of the rise of National Socialism back to the Protestant inclinations of Martin Luther and John Huss. He notes that Catholic regions of Germany generally oppose the NSDAP, while Protestant regions tended to support it. It must be noted that this exercise is very tenuous in effect, because the conclusion that Leddihn comes to is basically that Luther had no direct influence on Hitler nor the NSDAP, but Rather, he posits a dialectical evolution of the currents of thought, a combination of the revolutionary fervor of Catholicism mixed with the severe authoritarianism of Protestantism. He brings up some passages of Luther's which are effectively anti-Jewish and authoritarian, but he obviously cannot connect this directly to any quotations from Hitler. The best he has is an appreciation by one of Hitler's biographers for a single anti-Jewish pamphlet written by Luther. The weakness of Leddihn's position is obviated when we consider that fascism flourished in the heartland of Catholicism, Italy. There's no possibility of a Protestant influence dialectically creating the totalitarian conditions of that state. If it's the case that the Reformation inflicted this upon Catholicism, then Lenin's argument that Catholics were more apt to oppose National Socialism wouldn't make any sense. I believe we can, therefore, simply dismiss the arguments of Leddihn here. Leddihn then ends by adumbrating the rise of the NSDAP, which perhaps began with National Socialism in the Czech Sudetenland just before the 20th century. I have few objections to this historiography, and it may be of note to those who are interested in the early years of the rise of the Nazis. But what I am most interested in is that in the conclusion of this book, where Leddihn proposes a solution to the problem of democracy in countries like America, in which monarchical restoration is impossible. Leddihn proposes a compromise between elitist and democratic principles, in which the nation is ruled by an elected diet and a board of appointed experts. Between these bodies rules a monarch, and I say rules with scare quotes because, as Leddihn states, the role of the monarch is merely as an umpire between these governing bodies. He has no real sovereignty, and his only role is to either support the diet or to support the experts in matters of controversy. Needless to say, I believe that no good can come from compromise with the devil. If it's true that the myth of self-government induces the public to desire control over their political institutions, then I don't see how a combination of democracy and monarchy can turn out any differently than it has in the UK, where the public routinely votes for security rather than liberty, and during which the monarch is completely absent as a countervailing force. It's worth noting that in the UK, as well as other parliamentary monarchies such as Japan, the monarch does reserve the right to dissolve the diet, but this right is never invoked. The monarch ends up never fulfilling his balancing role nor availing himself of his theoretical sovereignty. Leddihn has missed that the whole reason why monarchies guarantee liberty is because their rule is by nature limited. To posit democracy as a limiting mechanism is obviously nonsense, not least because monarchy is already limited, but also because if the people are treated in any way as the source of the sovereignty and legitimacy of any part of the government, then the sovereignty thereby produced becomes truly unlimited. Then we might also consider the bureaucratic body of experts more specifically. One might say that the role of the board of experts is to serve as a surrogate aristocracy, which limits the power of the monarch and diet. But truly, it cannot serve this function because the other bodies are not reliant upon it to rule. It, at best, serves the same role as Senate committees in the United States, which deliberate and research on special technical questions. It by itself would have no real authority, since it does not have access to hard power. We see in democratic countries, wherever there is a coup, it is carried out by the executive. Without the ability to harness control over this hard power, the board of experts cannot serve its role of limiting power in any conceivable way. What differentiated aristocrats from this board of experts is that they had direct control of the nation's military capacities, such that the monarch was relying upon them to rule. I believe that if Leddihn's system were implemented, it would simply lead to an eventual coup instituted by the monarch on behalf of the people, who split allegiances and the diet, cause incorrigible conflict that they would seek a leader to resolve. It would simply end up becoming absolutism again, because absolutism developed on the same strategy of the high and the low versus the middle as quote-unquote democratic communism did in Russia. So why not instead recommend absolutism? Most of this book has, in actual fact, been a defense of absolutism. Why balk at the end? Why cave to democracy when you have spent 250 pages criticizing it? Now, I have said that some of this book's arguments are outdated, and what I mean by that is that modern so-called liberal states are not really democratic anymore. I'm writing a review of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, and reading that book, combined with witnessing the political crises of elections in Romania and Georgia, as well as what is happening in Germany with the AfD, have convinced me that we no longer live in democratic times. Our countries cannot be said to be ruled by the people, or even to respect the general will of the people in any charitable way. What has truly happened is that liberal countries have become authoritarian bureaucracies. If elections turn out in a way that upsets the bureaucrats, they quickly annul the election. If a party advances a radical platform, the other parties utilize the bureaucratic machinery to ban or prevent that party from running. What is most ironic about this is that the situation has flipped one of Leddihn's observations on its head, namely his idea that Europe was comparatively more democratic than the United States. It turns out that Europe is actually less democratic today. Despite Germany's AfD merely being an immigration skeptic party, there is much talk among politicians of banning it from the ballot for radicalism. What governs today is not the will of the people, but rather the paradox of tolerance. It states basically that if we allow intolerant people to participate in politics, it will undo democracy. Therefore, we must disallow intolerant people from participating in the democracy. Obviously, this position stems from the same basic realization as Plato and Leddihn have, which is that democracy produces tyrannies, although Karl Popper would not admit that. To avoid this, democratists have begun instituting their own tyranny ahead of the curve. Thus, it's not so much that the evolutionary process of class conflict or the politicization of all subjects ends up creating tyranny, but rather it is actually the fear of this tyranny that has caused the modern tyranny. It isn't to say that the creation of a universal polity is not fundamentally behind this, or that class conflict can be ignored, but rather it is to say that things have advanced in a way that Leddihn could not have predicted, namely that democratists themselves would become skeptical of democracy. As far as anti-democratic books are concerned, this one is fine, but one can find many of these arguments handled more concisely in a book like Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. Plus, Hoppe, drawing from the elite theory of Bertrand de Jouvenel, dispenses entirely with the pretense of rule by the people in democratic countries. In that way, Hoppe's book is much more up-to-date than Leddihn's. Thus, if I had to recommend a single anti-democratic book to a conservative, I would prefer Hoppe to Leddihn, perhaps not least because Hoppe is less hostile to racialism and less likely to recommend compromise. I would even say that to a reader interested in a defense of reactionary ideas, I think Julius Evola has a more coherent and traditionally valid picture of what the principles of royalty really are. He is not opposed to liberty in the same vein as Leddihn, but he is also less likely to compromise traditionality with individualism or democracy. He has recognized that individualism is just the counterpart to collectivism and that traditional societies fall out of the dichotomy entirely. It also stands to be said that Evola, on the question of race, is vastly more traditional and rational than Leddihn. In Evola, we lack Leddihn's opposition of race to inequality, which plagues the latter's work with contradiction. Overall, I am generally disappointed by liberty or equality. It tends to more so display the author's modern prejudices than it does provide a solid basis for a defense of reaction. Some of its arguments are outdated, most of them are completely derivative and unoriginal, and his historical analysis in the case of monarchy is incomplete, or in the case of National Socialism, generally tenuous. This author's tendency to compromise with modernity rather than to resist it renders one unsurprised when among this book's exponents are people like William F. Buckley and those at the Mises Institute. This author puts almost a sacred quality onto business and property, which makes one wonder if he, despite all his protestations, really has a bourgeois element to his personality. He has somehow managed to marry reactionism with capitalism in such a way as to give almost an overture to so-called neo-reactionaries. It should be noted that at no point in the traditional world was there an absolute right of persons to private property, nor was private ownership elevated to a sacred status. To criticize National Socialism as communistic because it reserved the right of confiscation is nonsense. We can clearly see in the age of medieval serfdom that private property was not a universal value, and in the requirements of businesses to first be chartered, we can see also that the idea of free enterprise and the absolute right to dispense with one's property were rejected. Traditional states were in many ways anti-bourgeois, which is part of the reason for the revolution in France. Furthermore, we can see that Leddihn neglected to examine certain contingent elements of National Socialism. For example, it was always understood by the Nazis that National Socialism was an emergency and temporary government meant to help Germany recover from the Treaty of Versailles, as well as to face her enemies in the East and West. Leddihn even admits that tyrannies eventually evolve into other types of government. For example, the Roman dictatorship of Caesar eventually became a republic, which later became a monarchy. Perhaps there is not so much reason to detest the evolution of democracies into National Socialism, socialism, or fascism, as there is to argue that one should instead tolerate these developments and see where they lead in the future. Thus, the author's proposition that we ought to simply domicile with the devil of republic or democracy in the West, just for the sake of holding on to a dubious liberalism, is fundamentally questionable. While I share the author's premise that National Socialism and other outgrowths of democracy are anti-traditional, he has not yet demonstrated that our societies can turn out any other way. Perhaps one must simply let conditions dialectically unfold before one can even think of changing them or restoring the traditional world. This brings to mind the thought that Evola had, which was that militarism might eventually serve as the basis for a restoration of the caste system. Besides, Leddihn is not even a restorationist. It just comes down to this: would I rather be potentially free or guaranteed to be a slave? I believe only a coward would choose the latter, and Leddihn, in many respects, is intellectually and politically cowardly.